Now in this lecture we are going to look at queue operations. Now which operations can be performed on queue? Now we can create a queue, then we can use enqueue method to insert elements to the queue, then we can use dequeue method for removing the elements from the queue, then pick method which is returning the top element from the queue, and isEmpty method which is checking that if this queue is empty or not, and isFull method is checking that if this queue is full or not, and delete queue method deletes the queue from the memory. Now before going to the details of these operations over here, now let's look at how can we implement queue. Now there are two ways of implementing queue, using arrays and linked lists. Now in case of array we are going to implement linear queue and circular queue, and in case of linked list we are going to implement only linear queue. Now we are going to discuss details of these implementations and we are going to implement them in practice. Now let's get started with linear queue in case of array. Now the first operations that we are going to do over here is we are going to create a queue. Now creating a linear queue using array is very easy. All we have to do, we have to instantiate the queue class over here with a fixed size. Now we know that when we are creating array, we have to set size for array. So that's why when we are creating a linear queue using array, we have to set size over here. Now when we are initializing this queue class over here with fixed size, it's going to create 6 contiguous cells in the memory. But in this case, these cells will be empty. Now with this, we have successfully created queue in the memory. Now after doing so, we have to create 2 more properties for this queue over here. We have to set beginning of queue to -1 and top of the queue to -1. So with this, we can easily identify that this queue is empty now. So we don't have any element in this queue over here. Now after creating this queue, our queue is now empty, so we have to insert some elements to our queue. Now for insertion, we are using enqueue method. So in case of queue, we use enqueue method to insert elements to this queue over here. Now let's look at how enqueue method works. Now when we are enqueuing an element to the queue, it's going to insert it at the 0th index in the array over here. So this means that this element comes first, so it's going to be served first. Now after doing so, we have to update the beginning and end of the queues over here. Now in this case, the beginning of queue is located at 0th index and top of the queue also is located at 0 index. So in this case, we have to set beginning of queue to 0 and the top of queue to 0 also. So with this, we can identify from where the queue starts and what is the index of top element in this queue over here. Now if we want to insert one more element over here, in this case, it's going to insert to the second cell over here, because as we said before, the elements that we are inserting to the queue will be located after the previous element. So if I, for example, want to insert one more element, which is 2 over here, it's going to be inserted at the index of 1, which is second cell over here. And now the top of queue is changed. So this means that the top of queue will be set to 1, because the top of queue, the last element in the queue, is located at the index of 1. Now if I enqueue one more element over here, for example 3, it's going to insert it to the next cell, which is cell 3 with the index of 2, and the top of queue will be 2, because in this case the last element is located at the index of 2, so we are setting top of queue to 2 over here. Now this is how enqueue method works in case of linear queue over here. Now let's see how can we remove elements from this queue over here. Now we said that when we are removing element, the first element that comes has to come out. So when we are calling the remove method, it's going to remove the first element from the queue over here. So in queue, we don't have remove method. In case of queue, we are using dequeue method. So let's look at how dequeue method works. Now when we are calling dequeue method, it does not take any parameters. So if we call the dequeue method, it has to return the first element from the queue, and this element will be removed from the queue over here. Now if we call the queue method for this queue over here, it's going to return 1, and 1 will be removed from this queue over here, and the beginning of the queue now is changed, because now the beginning of the queue is located at the index of 1. So that's why the beginning of queue will be updated to 1. Now if I call the queue method one more time, it's going to return in this case 2, because the beginning element is 2 now. And as you see, when we are calling the queue method, the element is get deleted from here and the beginning of queue updated to 2. This means that the beginning and the top of queue is located at the index of 2 over here. Now every time when we are dequeuing element from the linear queue over here, the beginning of queue changes this way, and we are updating the index of beginning of Q to this beginning of Q property over here. Now let's continue to the next method. Now the next method is pick method. Now pick method is responsible for returning an element from the beginning of this Q over here. Now in this case, when we are calling pick method, it's going to return 1 because the beginning of Q in this case is 1. So it's not going to remove this element from the Q over here. Now when we are calling the Q method, it's returning the first element, but it's removing that element from the Q. But in case of pick method, it's just returning the first element, but it's not removing the element from the Q. Now there might be cases that we just need to check the first element in the Q. So in this case, we are using pick method. Now the next method is empty method. Now isEmpty method returns true or false. So if we don't have any element in our Q, it returns true. If we have elements in our Q, it returns false. Now in this case, if we run isEmpty method for this Q over here, it's going to return false because in this case we have elements in our Q over here. Now the next method is full method. Now when we are creating a Q over here, we have said that the size will be 6 elements over here. So now if we exceed the number of 6 over here, the full method will return true. But in this case, if we run this full method for this Q over here, it's going to return false because in this case, it's not full. Now, when all elements is filled in these cells over here, in this case, it returns true. IsFull method and isEmpty method are very useful inside the Q and enqueue methods. So if our Q is empty, we cannot dequeue elements from it, and if our Q is full, we cannot enqueue elements to it. Now the last method is delete method. Now we are using delete method in case of Q for deleting the Q from the memory. So if we call delete method for this Q over here, it's going to delete all elements from the memory. So with this, we have successfully deleted Q from the memory. Now with this, we have come to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, I have explained you how the linear Q operation works in the memory. Now based on these logics that we have explained over here, in the next lecture, we are going to implement them in practice. So see you in the next lecture.